1 Samuel chapter 20 and also chapter 23, verses 16 through 18. The first question, what would have been Jonathan's natural desire for his future? We don't have to go too long on this. His father is the king. He's the prince. He's next in line to be king. The natural desire of Jonathan would be to replace his father as king over all Israel. What did he say he believed God's will was for his future? And this is in chapter 23 and verse 17. This is Jonathan speaking to David. He says, "Fear not, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find thee, and thou, David, shalt be king over Israel, and I shall be next unto thee. And that also Saul my father knoweth." That phrase there, I shall be next unto thee. Jonathan was convinced that it was God's will for him to be next to David, to be second place. Now, the last question, how can we apply this to ourselves? If you think back over your life, if you think back over your own dreams, the things that you pray about, the things that you've sought God for, and you look to God for guidance or are presently looking to God for guidance on, it's very rare, as I look at my own experience, as I listen to other Christians share their own testimonies, it's very rare that we feel that God is calling us to the second place. Usually we feel that God is calling us to a promotion. God is calling us to be the leader. God is calling us to be the manager. God is calling us to be the head elder. God is calling us to be the chief Sabbath school leader or the Sunday school leader. God is calling us to be the leader, the head, and not the tail. God is generally, when we think of what we believe God to be calling us to, we think of God calling us to be first place. But Jonathan, this faithful son of God, this faithful man of God, he was convinced that God was calling him to be second. And he had no hesitation about that. He had no problem with that. He was quite content with the fact that God was calling him to be second place. And I think if it's true that God is calling all of his children to different areas, he has to be calling someone to be second place. And why not me? Why not me? Why isn't it not that God is maybe calling me not to be the leader, not to be the chief speaker, but to be the Barnabas? In Acts, it talks about Paul and Barnabas going to a city, and they call Barnabas one name, referring to a Greek god, and call Paul another. But the reason they called him Paul that, was because because he was the chief speaker. Barnabas was the second person. He was the helper. Barnabas is the one who brought Paul to the apostles when they wouldn't receive him. Barnabas was the one who convinced them that Paul was indeed a new man, had indeed been converted. And yet Barnabas was content, like Jonathan, to be second to Paul. Why is it not that I feel that God calls me to be Barnabas? Why do I not feel that God may be calling me to be Shadrach or Meshach or Abednego? Why do I always have to be Daniel? Why do I always feel that God is calling me to be the prominent one, me to be the leader, me to be the one to speak to the king, me to be leader over all Babylon? Why is it not that God doesn't call me maybe to be Abednego? When we look through the Bible, there are instances in the Old and New Testament, as I've just listed a few, where God is calling people to be in a role of support for another Christian, for another follower of God, another believer. And the question I ask, I'm not saying that you're not being called to be the first, that you're not called to be the head, that you're not called to be the leader, but at least entertain the possibility that maybe God is calling you, maybe God has equipped you, maybe God is preparing you to be a support for someone else's ministry, a support for someone else's work. Maybe God is calling you to be the helper. And this is not in any way less noble of a position. This is not in any way less glorious. This is not in any way less a calling of God than when God calls David to be king, or God calls Daniel to stand before the king, or God calls Paul to stand before Gentiles and declare his mighty name. But we ought to feel that God is calling us somewhere and look to him to direct and look to him to decide where that should be it at the head or be it at the tail. In reality, God called Jesus to go from the top, the height of all heights, not even to be second, not even to be third, but Jesus came, as Philippians 2 said, he came all the way down and was obedient to death, even the death of a cross. Not just a human, not even a king among humans, but he came and took on the form of a servant among humans. And even not a servant alone, but a servant who was called a murderer, a thief, treated as a transgressor, counted with the transgressors, and killed as one of them. Jesus went from the height of heights and came down all the way. He was called of God all the way to the depths. And if that's where our Lord is, the servant is no greater than his Lord. If that's what God called Jesus to, all of us ought to be content, ought to be willing to accept wherever God shall call us, be it at the head or be it at the tail.